Hey everyone, how's it going? I'm Carlo from All You Can Board, and today I'm going to be previewing Coalitions. This is a game that is on Kickstarter as of June 16th. It's published by Phalanx Games and designed by first-time designer Andrew Rourke. So this is a game of area control and diplomacy set during the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, of course in Europe. It's mostly a 3 to 6 player game, but there is also a solo and a co-op variant, which we'll talk about a bit later. But basically you're going to be reenacting this period of history, and of course you're able to kind of change the outcomes and rewrite history along the way. A couple things I have to get out of the way before we get into this. The first is that this is not a review, and also this is not a paid preview. We were not paid to do this. However, the publisher did send us this prototype copy of the game in order to put together the preview, so keep in mind these are all prototype components. If you check out the Kickstarter page, I'm sure you'll see all kinds of stuff that already looks different than this, and the game will certainly look different in its final form. And the other thing is just that unfortunately, due to the pandemic and the restrictions here and how slow we have been in Manitoba to kind of get back to normal, unfortunately we have not had a chance to try this at the higher player counts where it seems like it's most recommended. So the focus of this video is basically going to be an overview of the systems, what you should be looking out for, and basically just give you an idea of whether or not you want to back this. So stick around and I will tell you all about Coalitions. So we're going to start by going over a brief overview of what you do in this game. I'm not going to cover all the rules in this game for a couple of reasons. First off, there's a lot of little intricacies that you're probably not going to remember, and the other thing is that there have been actually a significant number of rule changes and terminology changes over the past few weeks, even since we got the original copy of the game, so I'm not sure what else might change from now until when the game is in its final version, so I'm just going to kind of focus on a basic overview of what's going on. In Coalitions, players can play as one of the 6 nations: France, Britain, Russia, Austria, Prussia, or the Ottoman Empire. France and Britain are always at war with each other. The other 4 nations can either ally with France, ally with Britain, remain neutral, or start a war of expansion, which is basically armed neutrality. And these allegiances and coalitions can switch throughout the game. This is represented on the political status marker, which we'll look at in more detail later. All nations start with 17 influence, which is basically your victory points. The game can end in one of 2 ways. If any nation reaches or exceeds 40 influence, they win, in which case any nations that were in a coalition with that nation would also win, albeit to a lesser extent. The other way the game can end is if any non-French nation that's not in a coalition with France controls the capital city of Paris, then they would immediately win. So then how do you actually gain influence and gain those points to try and win if you're not capturing Paris? Well, it's mostly from either winning battles or controlling disputed territories. So speaking of territories, we're going to take a closer look at the game board now. So the map is a broad representation and kind of a simplified look at the political situation in Europe between the years in the French Revolution. During this period, all kinds of borders were changing, territories were won and lost, and the map has basically been distorted to minimize the size of the seas and maximize the amount of room for gameplay on land. You'll notice many of the territories have a color on them. That just signifies that's the nation that belongs to, blue being France, green being Russia, etc. There are also disputed territories, which are these striped territories. The color of the stripes indicates which nations can claim the territory for themselves. These disputed territories have a number in black circle, which represents the amount of influence a claiming nation receives for controlling it, and only the nation whose color stripes are shown in a disputed territory can actually gain influence in this way. Other nations controlling these territories receive income instead of influence. In order to gain control of a territory that doesn't belong to your nation, you would have to have a garrison in that nation. Garrisons are things that you can leave behind when moving out of an area or moving into an area, as long as there's no battle to be resolved first, which we're going to talk about a bit later as well. So in terms of the actual flow of the game, it uses a very convenient Rondel system, which they refer to as the Wheel of War. It has 6 different actions on this wheel, and each round, each of the 6 nations will be assigned to one of those actions. So every round, each player will take one of those 6 actions, and then the wheel will rotate, and each player will then get to take the next action available to them. As I mentioned before, there have been some minor rule changes lately, and since the most recent version of the rulebook that we were looking at for these Rondel actions, on the Kickstarter page, it seems they have been changed slightly, so unfortunately I won't be able to go into these in too much detail, but a brief overview of what these types of actions can do is there's going to be stuff like either gaining and discarding battle cards, which will help you to bolster your forces when you're challenging someone to try and fight over a territory. Another player might be doing things like gaining income for the territories that they control, spending that income on all kinds of stuff, whether it's adding more unit tokens to the board, gaining more of those battle cards for the battle. You can even do stuff like increase your nation's morale or national will, which is used to spend on more battle cards to resolve conflicts. There's all kinds of stuff you can do. The main action here, the one where most of the game is going to happen usually, is movement. Now, this is where one of the most prominent aspects of the diplomacy comes into play with the game, with the system that was initially called the Enabler system. There's a very good video on YouTube from the designer Andrew Rourke explaining the Enabler system. It is now referred to as the Activator. The way this works, in short, is whenever the movement phase happens, let's say the nation that is supposed to move is going to move at least one time, but might be granted a second and third movement. So let's say I'm playing as Russia, and it's my turn to move. The first thing I have to do is choose an activator. I must choose another nation that is not allied or not in a coalition with me, and I must basically ask that nation, that player, permission to be able to move. Now, as I said, you're going to move between 1 to 3 times. So you're going to get to do your one movement action first for free, and the activator has no say in that. But after you finish that first movement, you have to ask the activator, can I move again? If they allow you to move, you're going to be able to do a second movement action, and as a result of them allowing you to do that, they're going to gain morale. So there's this kind of give and take where you're trying to decide, as the activator, how much do I want to let this person move, because they might move around the map and do things that may or may not benefit me. We don't know. We're not allies when we're agreeing to this. But as the activator, the more you allow that movement, the more your morale can go up. The other thing I'd like to mention at this point real quick before we move on from the Wheel of War is that in the previous rules that we had read, it had mentioned there's a diplomacy phase where you're basically going to be deciding whether you're going to ally with the British, ally with the French, remain neutral, or go on your own and start a war of expansion. So previously, the rules had indicated that once the Rondel or the Wheel of War had done a full circle, after all those 6 actions had kind of been taken and it had reset, the diplomacy phase would trigger and all players would take part in this. However, on the Kickstarter page right now, it looks like the diplomacy phase has been kind of moved into one of the areas of the Wheel of War. But basically what's going to happen is it's going to be an open discussion phase where players can decide whether they want to ally with the French, ally with the British, or go off on their own. However, as the British player or the French player, you don't have to accept that coalition. Someone can say, you know what, I'm going to go and ally with the British, and the British player can say, no, you're not, I want nothing to do with you. And that's kind of where it ends. Then you might be just stuck going on your own, or then you might start to beg the French to see if they want to be in a coalition with you. So now let's talk about player count and downtime and all that sort of stuff. So again, I mentioned the game goes up to 6 players, and in my opinion, that is definitely where it's going to shine the most, because these 6 nations are always in play. So if you play with, let's say, 5 players, one player is going to be controlling 2 nations, and everyone else is going to be controlling 1. And if you're playing with 3 or 4 players, then there's going to be multiple players controlling multiple, or one player might even be managing 3 nations. So in a way, a player that's managing 2 or 3 nations compared to someone who's managing 1, they're going to have a lot more to do. They might take a lot more time in that Wheel of War phase, because they're figuring out actions for one nation as well as another nation. And there's an opportunity for someone to feel like maybe the person who's playing with 2 factions is maybe playing the game more. But I think there's one thing to keep in mind about this, is if you're the person who has played this game and knows it and you're introducing new players, you should be the one probably taking on that second nation, playing those extra roles, and in that way, who knows, that might even balance it out more for a first play, giving you that challenge of managing 2 or 3 nations. The one thing it does, though, is that because you can't be, let's say you're controlling 2 nations, they have to be basically having similar intentions along the way. You can't be attacking, using those 2 nations to attack each other, for example. So, or go off in different directions. It kind of forces you to, it pigeonholes you a little bit in terms of making you go in one direction with both of your nations. There's still some room for expanding, but overall, I think the game is going to be at its most interesting and its most interactive by far when it's at 6 players, or at least 5. Now let's get back to this Wheel of War for a moment, because when we were first sent this prototype and the initial rulebook a couple months back, originally the Rondel and Wheel of War system didn't exist, and there wasn't a sequence of turns where basically this nation would do their movement, and then the next nation would do their, mobilization, then another nation would do their movement, and you were kind of going turn by turn by turn, watching everyone do their stuff. And, I think there were some issues. Some people complained maybe there's a little bit of downtime, a little too much of it. So they came up with this Wheel of War, which allows, again, you can, they're kind of offering it as a simultaneous play option, and they encourage this should eliminate a lot of the downtime in the game by allowing players to take their actions simultaneously. In theory, it sounds excellent. In practice, I'm not sure yet how well it's going to work, because a lot of these actions are dependent on each other, and there is an order listed, like this one will technically trigger first, second, third, fourth, fifth, and sixth, if you prefer to go in order rather than playing them out simultaneously. And movement's always going to be that sixth action. So let's say I'm the player who's moving. Sure, I could start doing my movement and playing simultaneously, but how am I going to know where I want to move or who I want to potentially get into a battle with before I see, where players are spending their income, who's, doing what other actions on the board, who's going to potentially ally with someone. So although in some ways it can create for simultaneous play, and I think with groups that have played it a lot, there might be certain aspects that can be done simultaneously, or maybe certain actions, but ultimately, again, if I'm the movement player and I need to be picking an activator, and I'm saying, hey, you over there, can I move again? And they're saying, hang on a second, I'm spending my income. I'm like, okay, so then I'm waiting. Then there is going to be downtime. So I think, again, it kind of will eliminate some of the downtime, but don't be mistaken, there will still be downtime in the game, and it's not going to be entirely simultaneously, because ultimately I don't think it would work all that well for the game. Now I want to talk about asymmetry in this game, because it's done in a very interesting way and something that totally caught me off guard. When I originally read through the rules and the setup and everything, I remember thinking, these don't seem that asymmetric. There aren't any special powers. This isn't a game like Rourke or the Voyages of Marco Polo where, you feel like you do something that breaks the game, or you're playing the game in a completely different way from everyone. A lot of it is very subtle and has to do with either the setup or, little things that come along the way. I would say the two most asymmetric ones, of course, because they're the big players here, are going to be the French and the British. Obviously, the French are kind of, have everyone coming for them. It's Napoleon's army. So I mentioned before that one of the main win conditions is if a non-French territory or nation that isn't allied with the French controls Paris, that they would win the game. So because of that, the French will start off with the most powerful armies on the board by far. You've got your general tokens, or your general standees, and underneath those you've got your unit tokens, and you can see the French are kind of stacked at the start. They're ready for battle. They also start with a bunch of morale right off the start, and they start with a bigger card of hands. You also have a bigger hand limit size with the French. You can hold 10 cards, whereas the other nations can mostly just hold 6 or 7. The British have some other interesting stuff too, because the British have a very weak army at the start. If you look, they've got 3 generals, but they've got barely any unit tokens under them. They're very, very weak. But the game starts with Russia and Austria in coalition with the British, and the British also get additional income that no other nation gets. They can basically subsidize some of this income and give it to other nations in exchange for gaining influence points. The basic idea being that the British are just desperate to find anyone who will ally with them to take down the French. And even if those coalitions fall apart, they'll find another way to, bribe someone else to join their coalition and just stubbornly keep trying to take down the French. So the British start off weak, but they have all these little incentives along the way. So I would say the most complicated ones to play are probably the British and the French, just for the little rules intricacies. Otherwise, the other 4 nations are a lot more similar. The main difference has to do with the setup. I mean, the Prussians start as neutral. The Ottoman Empire starts at War of Expansion. Also, the Ottoman Empire is kind of in this corner off on their own. The Prussians and the Austrians are kind of in the middle of everything. So there's a lot of these little subtleties. A lot of it's not going to be immediately clear on your first or maybe even second play. There's going to be a lot of depth to explore here from the asymmetry. You might even notice, oh, hey, the Russian player tends to be able to get that really important territory on that side of the map earlier. So the game is going to take on this level of depth and level of kind of like rewarding you for exploring the different strategies and the different asymmetric starts and the little, things that they can, different directions they can send you in throughout the game. I also want to quickly talk about player elimination because, in these types of games, there often is player elimination and there is no such thing in this game. Basically, when you are eliminated, you become neutral. And one of the things I didn't mention before about being neutral is that in the income phase, your income is doubled. So that is a way to kind of keep you in the game, allow you to claw your way back in, either by just kind of getting more income and or forming alliances, because players might want to form an alliance with you if they think you're not much of a threat. So I like that for such a long game, a player who falls behind still has ways to, offer other people to be useful, they can still find their way to claw their way back into the game. And I think that's an excellent thing to do for a game of this level of complexity and also the length of the game. So speaking about complexity, I have to touch on this because I believe it is on the Phalanx Games website in the Coalition section, or perhaps on the BGG page, where they've referred to this as a light Euro game. And with all due respect to Phalanx, personally, I don't think it is accurate to call this a light game. I mean, the rulebook in its current iteration that we've seen is about 6,000 words. It's about a 25 page Microsoft Word document. To me, that looks like it's going to be, if I had to guess, there's no weight listed on the BGG page currently. I would think it's probably going to fall somewhere between a 2.5 and a 3.0, maybe even 3.2, 3.3 kind of thing. I would say it's definitely at least a medium weight game, might even be pushing over medium, definitely not in heavy. And I think once you get to play it a couple times, it doesn't seem as complicated as it does at first. But again, there's a lot of little intricacies along the way, things that might not necessarily be marked on the board that you might need to consult the rules to be reminded. Again, some of these issues also might be might go away because, again, these are prototypes. So there might be player aids that come with the game. There might be more stuff indicated on the boards. So now the most important questions of all. Should you back it? Is this game for you? That really depends. To be honest with you, it is a fairly niche game in many ways. I know a lot of people who this game just wouldn't be for their group, regardless of how good it is. Then again, I know a lot of people who would love this. If you like the history, if you're really into this historical period, you like war games, you like learning about this kind of stuff, I mean, this is going to pull you right in. It's going to, especially if you really know this history, the idea of making these different moves, these subtle moves along the way is really interesting. And even as someone who, I'll be completely honest, I know very little about this period in history. It's been a long time since I learned about this. And even as someone who normally wouldn't gravitate to this type of game, I was intrigued enough that I totally took the publisher up on receiving this game because I thought a game that kind of focuses on this and has these diplomacy aspects and allows you to explore this and go in these kind of alternate historical routes is really intriguing. So especially if you're playing with other players who, you might just have a friend who's like a history major or something, and they might be able to make the game more interesting for you. So I think that definitely helps. The other thing I want to mention is if you're the type of person that collects tons of games and most of the games you have, you play like once or twice a year, I don't know if this is the right game for you or your group. I mean, it's one thing if you think that, again, if the history is interesting enough for you and that maybe even the solo, you would be happy enough with the solo mode, then maybe that's worth it for you already. Otherwise, I think to really get the most enjoyment out of this game, you're going to want to play this with the same group of players or at least similar players, and you're going to want to play it fairly frequently, at least a few times a year, fairly close together so that you're not forgetting all the rules or, you get an hour in and realize, oh yeah, I forgot about that, I should have done that differently, and you kind of feel like you're behind. So I think it's definitely something that has a lot of appeal for groups that want to really dig into this, explore the history, explore the different strategies. So even though there's a lot to like here and there's a lot that really interests me, I have to mention there are a few red flags here that you guys have to know about if you're going to consider backing this. The first being, like I mentioned before, there's been quite a few rule changes recently. When we first got the game sent to us, we had an edition of the rules, learned how to play through the game, started putting together our material for the video, and shortly, maybe a day or two before shooting, we realized there was an update to the rules and there was some, there were some changes. So we reached out to the publisher, and credit to them, they got back to us very quickly and answered almost all of our questions that we had. However, then I started preparing again. We rescheduled our filming, and since then, actually just today before coming right over to the studio to film, I noticed there were some other changes on the Board Game Geek page as well as the Kickstarter page that unfortunately we had not been made aware of in time. So again, it's unfortunate that I haven't been able to give you guys as much of a detailed look at the rules, but because there have been so many changes recently and it still doesn't seem to be a final version of the rule book, I just don't want to confuse you guys by getting into this stuff. And this is for you to know as well. I mean, if you have concerns about, the level of play testing with the new rules, or is the game going to be, is this close to a final version of the rule book? That's something that you have every right to be skeptical of. If I was going to be backing, a game that requires this much of a time investment and a financial investment as well, I'd like to have some assurances that the game I'm backing is going to be, that's the game I'm going to get. I don't want to back a game and then find out later that the rules have changed a whole bunch. I don't think it's going to change enough to, make the game play significantly differently or change your experience. But I mean, if the game has been, this game has been in the works for a few years now, and it's been play tested extensively with those previous rules. And so I am a little concerned when there's this many rule changes so close to the launch of the Kickstarter campaign. I mean, I know the game probably won't be shipped and fulfilled for quite some time still, so there's plenty of time still to kind of refine everything and get these rules to a more, finalized state. But it's just something to keep in mind if you're kind of on the fence about that. Don't be shy to ask questions in the comments on the Kickstarter page from the publisher. The other thing for me, I don't know if it's really fair to call this one a red flag because it might just be a personal choice. I know a lot of people don't mind this kind of thing in games, but for me, the Activator mechanic that I mentioned before, there's a bit of a thematic disconnect, and maybe this is just my lack of historical knowledge. Maybe there is an explanation for this that I'm just not really getting here. But so again, as I mentioned before, the Activator, you're basically choosing a nation that is not in an allegiance with you or not in a coalition with you, and asking them if they will allow you to move beyond your first granted movement action. So let's say I'm playing as the Austrians and I'm asking the Ottoman Empire if I can move. From a thematical standpoint, in real life, asking a potential enemy if I can move and they gain morale out of it, there's just a bit of a weird, why are they gaining morale and why is an enemy potentially on the other side of Europe granting me access to move? Especially because the move doesn't even necessarily have to do with the Ottomans. I can say, hey, Ottoman player, can I move? And they might say, well, that depends. Where are you going to move? And I can say, oh, well, I'll probably go over there and then I can do something different. Or I can, try and make a deal with them on where I'm moving. But, one player might be moving 3 times on their turn. Another player might only move once. And the difference has to do with the other players basically allowing you to move. And again, just in a kind of more real world context, I just don't understand the kind of thematic integration of that. And as this campaign is going on, details might change. Feel free to leave a comment below if you have any questions, anything you want clarity on. I'll do my best. I'm going to keep an eye on this game. I'm going to be trying to answer questions if I can to the best of my ability. Again, because of rule changes and things like that, I might not be at the forefront of being the best person to answer, but we're putting this video out. We want to help you guys decide if the game is for you. So let us know if you have any questions. You can send us an email as well, allyoucanboard@gmail.com, or leave a comment below. Otherwise, that's it. If you like this video, please consider subscribing to our channel. We do all kinds of stuff, how to play videos, reviews, Kickstarter previews, list videos, all kinds of stuff like that. Really appreciate the support. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.